Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Wednesday, December the 14th, 2022. Yesterday we started looking at our reading from this past Sunday, Isaiah 42, 1 through 9, which has been identified by scholars as the first of four servant songs. And I thought today I'd talk a little bit more about the other three and how they all kind of relate to one another, more specifically, how they then point in particular to Jesus. The Isaiah 42, 1 through 9, which was our reading this past Sunday. Then there's also Isaiah 49, verses 1 through 7, Isaiah 50, verses 4 through 9, and finally Isaiah 52, verse 13 through 53, verse 12. So as we heard in Isaiah 42, God says, "Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations." And I'm using, in my remarks this morning, some work done by Dr. J. Nicholas Reed, who's an Old Testament scholar. And as he points out, that first servant song that we heard in Isaiah 42 depicts the servant of the Lord establishing justice. And this justice would be go forth as of a law in which the nations would hope. In short, as Professor Reed points out, emerging from the ashes of the Babylonian exile or captivity would come a servant of the Lord who would establish his kingdom of justice that would constitute not only the hope of Israel, but the hope of the nations. And then we move to Isaiah 49, in particular a verse that says, "I will make you as a light to for the nations, that my salvation may reach the end of the earth." We heard a reference to the light, to be a light to the nations. We'll talk about that later this week. But here in Isaiah 49, the servant is actually the one identified to be a light to the nations. The mission is to return Israel back to God, but not just as theirs to be their savior, he will be a light to the nations. And then we move to the third servant song in Isaiah 50. "The Lord has opened my ear. I was not rebellious. I turned not backward. I gave my back to those who strike, my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting." And so here you have introduced this idea of the faithfulness of the servant resulting in suffering, and yet through this God sustains and helps the servant. But again, even in the face of suffering, the servant did not turn away, just as Jesus stared down the suffering that was awaiting him in Jerusalem, and rather than turning back, set his face toward the city, as we hear in Luke 9. And then finally, in that fourth and final servant song, which begins in Isaiah 52 and ends in Isaiah 53, we'll probably recognize the verses I'm about to read, part of that servant song, as something we hear on Ash Wednesday. "He was despised and rejected," or I should say Good Friday. "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." And so the fourth servant song kind of brings everything together that the other three were talking about. But now it becomes crystal clear, as Professor Reed talks about it, that this victory of the servant is going to be achieved only through suffering, and not, as he puts it, not just despite suffering, because the servant will be marred and beaten, wounded for the transgression of his people. All we like sheep have gone astray, but the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. And not surprisingly, then, these four servant songs in Isaiah were remembered, recalled, and held up later in light of Jesus and understanding Jesus. Because remember, Jesus the desire for, the expectation, the hope for a Messiah, anointed one, a king, had to do more thinking about King David and the glory of his reign, and the highlight of the nation of Israel in terms of their success and power and so forth. And then suddenly you have one who comes poor and humble, suffers and dies. And it's at this point then they look back in their scriptures and see, oh, Isaiah is talking about a servant. And Jesus kind of fits that model, entirely different from what they expected. And this whole idea of humility and of being immersed in the human experience, even human suffering, begins at Christmas as we draw closer to the Christmas holiday. We're reminded that Jesus, as undoubtedly I'm sure I'll share before our celebrations are over, that Jesus did not fulfill the expectations, did not come as one who would expect, as we would expect him to come, but came as a helpless child born to poor peasants in a town a village they did not even live in, and yet that's how God chose to come to be among us. And there's so much more to say and so much more that I will say, but here we just have this whole idea that that Jesus is more of the suffering servant in Isaiah than he is the king like David had been. Well, we're going to continue tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit about this notion of justice, and then also being a light to the nations and what light means in our lives. So until then, take care. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.